Hi, we complete our entry into 1 Samuel 19 today with a strange story that ends this chapter. And as we'll see, it echoes a previous story, and although many scholars jump past it because it doesn't seem to be about the immediate issues of the relationship between Saul and David, we're going to pause on it because I think the authors have put it there for a reason, and it says a lot about the relationship between kings and prophets and the people of Israel and Judah as the monarchy is developed here and the reigns between Saul and David. So let's look at on the right side of the screen. You can see the chart we've been using throughout the last two chapters that show the interlocking themes in green of Saul's children siding for or with David. And we saw Jonathan a couple of videos ago and Michal in the last video. And the blue was David's success, especially in chapter 18, as we saw above, this refrain of David having success. And in 19, David defeating the Philistines. And as we'll see here, the refrain of fleeing and escaping. And then the red is Saul struggling with this. And that's the passage we're going to be on today. We're going to see David escape. And David's not in the scene today, although Samuel is, which is a surprise. Even though David's in the location, David doesn't show up on the scene. And Saul finds himself among a company of prophets. And according to New RSV, falls into a prophetic frenzy, although there's a translation issue that we're going to look at carefully. As we were looking at the key words as well, I actually changed this from what I'd used before and resubmit it to the web page so you can have the updated one, because I had not had in the passage we're looking at today, which is the one at the bottom there, as you can see, highlighting the location, both Ramah and Naoth and Ramah, repeated over and over again, and as you can see, for no apparent obvious reason. For example, you see down at the bottom, and someone said they were at Naoth and Ramah. He went there toward Naoth and Ramah. And we don't really need to hear that twice, do we? So that's repeated a number of times. And then as several scholars have acutely noted here, the word also, gam in Hebrew, which doesn't seem like a big word, but it's 8 times in this little paragraph, highlighting the unity of what's going on, that everybody who seems to move into this space falls into this prophetic frenzy, again, or however we might want to translate that. So those are some of the issues here as we look at this. And as we do, we'll note that we've seen a very similar scene back in chapter 10. And scholars want to argue about what is the relationship between these two scenes. Some suggest that the one in chapter 19 is a parody of the first one, or some kind of a memory of it in a different way, so it's like the same scene repeated again. Others suggest, as we've often seen from different sources, although these two passages are so similar, it's hard to imagine how different sources would repeat such a very similar story here, and we'll look at those details in a moment. But what's different, obviously, is the narrative context. In chapter 10, Saul is not king yet, and so he's just in the process of being on this journey. And we see at the top, it says, God gave him another heart. And the signs that Samuel had predicted were fulfilled that day. So Saul is just at the very beginning of his journey there. And in our situation now, of course, he's already decided that David is an enemy. He's tried to pin him against the wall with his spear more than once, and David has eluded him, and he's lost David as his lyre player because he's now treating him as his enemy. So the context is very different here in chapter 19 than it was in chapter 10. Let's look just at some of the similarities and some of the differences. And one of the issues, as you can see in the part that's highlighted with green highlighting there, both down here and up here, one of the issues that scholars work with to see whether they might imagine multiple sources. Because in 1535a, we heard Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. But plainly, here's Samuel standing in charge of these prophets, and the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul. But Saul also comes down and goes there, and he too fell into a frenzy before Samuel. So plainly, Saul and Samuel are there together. In fact, literally, as we'll see, as the New RSV so often has been doing in this section and throughout, covering over the Hebrews' use of body parts as means of perception. So here it is, he fell, as we'll see, before Samuel's face. And so they are face to face, in contrast to here, where it says Samuel did not see Saul again until his death. So, and of course, he'll see him after his death. I shouldn't say, of course, if you're not familiar, but Saul, in his desperation, will call Samuel up from the dead, from Sheol, way later in the story. So we see also in red this refrain. 2 versions of it in chapter 10. Is Saul also among the prophets? And therefore it became a proverb, is Saul also among the prophets? And we see a similar thing. Therefore it is said, Is Saul also among the prophets? But what a strange thing that it's a proverb, a question. Is Saul among the prophets? Why would people have a tradition where they keep repeating that? And that's something we have to pay attention to here, both in relation to the translation and to the role of prophets in the Hebrew Bible and in monarchy, as we'll see. So let's start with our passage and get ourselves set for the context, the narrative context, and then we'll look at the question of prophets. So as we saw, David fled and escaped, and that's the one here echoing the key words that we saw repeatedly, fled and escaped multiple times. Notice in this chapter in particular, it's a nice example of how the authors help us to see which parts are units by having key words that don't go throughout an entire chapter. Of course, the chapters are only made in the Masoretic era in the 12th or 13th century anyway. The original text didn't have chapters or verses or spaces or punctuation or vowels or any of those things. So a way that people could help people keep track if they're listening or if they're copying is with key words. And so we saw in that first paragraph how killing and king and sin and my father were key words, and yet down here none of those things are key words, but a whole bunch of other things are key words, highlighting the unity of this paragraph. And the unity of the paragraph is about the unity within the paragraph among the people as well. So the key word also, as I noted, already conveys that. So David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah. And this ought to come as a surprise. We last saw Samuel at 16:13 when he anointed David, and then the text told us he went back to Ramah, and that was that. Is Samuel expecting him? Let's look at the map a little bit so we can see how close Ramah is right here to Gibeah of Saul. So not very far. This map doesn't happen to have a scale on it, but this is just a couple of miles. So really not very far, and that makes sense given that Saul is going to send repeated groups of messengers back and forth across this area. What we don't know is what Naoth is. As Fackelman, among others, note, the location is a meaning are unknown. It's only found in the scene. Bailey makes a suggestion that it could mean house, as in David and Samuel are living together, although that's just a pure guess. And Tsumura suggests that the original term could be relating to the Hebrew nave, meaning pasture or abode of shepherds outside the city. And that's possible, but we simply just don't know. But it seems to be a subset, even though it said he went to Samuel at Ramah, and now he said they settled at Naoth every other time we hear Naoth in Ramah. So Saul was told David's at Naoth and Ramah, and this is not because he's apparently sent messengers. The next verse shows him sending messengers. So this is somebody who's just a tattletale. This is somebody who's on Saul's side. He is the king, after all, as far as anybody else seems to know, and that he's looking for David, and we'll see other people who side with Saul along the way, including in one horribly murderous scene where 85 priests are killed apparently by one man who's on Saul's side. So Saul is told that David's in Naoth and Ramah. Perhaps somebody's thinking they can get rewarded for that, although it's anonymous. So Saul sent messengers to take David, who of course we'd last seen had escaped from with the help of Michal, Saul's daughter, who helped him out the window and then covered up the bed with the teraphim covered with goat hair and his clothes. So now Saul is after to take David, and when they saw the company of the prophets in a frenzy, and we'll look at the word in a frenzy in a minute, but this image of the company of prophets, and also is described as band of prophets. This is the only time this particular word is used in the Masoretic text in the Hebrew, lakakoth, to describe company, but other words are used to describe a company of prophets, and we need to look a little bit about what bands of prophets are to make sense of this scene. So in the Hebrew Bible, especially right here in the Deuteronomistic history, which if you're not familiar is everything from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, there are two groups of prophets in groups. One is the royal group who work for a king, and we'll look at it briefly at a passage of that, and another is a group of prophets who are independent of the king and often prophesying against the king, especially in the company of Elijah and Elisha in the book of 2 Kings. So let's look at this humorous passage. We won't look at the whole thing, but only the first part of it here from 1 Kings 22 to get some sense of this. So the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 of them, and said to them, "Shall I go to battle against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain?" They said, "Go up, for Yahweh will give it into the hand of the king." But Jehoshaphat, who's the king of Judah, by the way, the context here is that the king of Israel and the king of Judah are trying to combine against a common enemy. But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there no other prophet of Yahweh here of whom we may inquire?" Of course, there's 400 of them, so what is it he's asking exactly? The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "There is still one other by whom we may inquire of Yahweh, Micaiah son of Imlah, but I hate him, for he never prophesies anything favorable about me, but only disaster." Jehoshaphat said, "Let the king not say such a thing." And if you don't know the story, it goes on that Micaiah prophesies victory for the king, and Jehoshaphat said, "Come on, tell me what's really going to happen." And he says, "You're going to be destroyed." And Micaiah ends up in jail, just as he expected. So that's a little parody of what happens when kings turn to prophets, basically as yes men, as the inside company people who tell them what they want to hear. And when they say what they don't want to hear, they get in trouble. So house prophets like that, and we'll see later in 2 Samuel whether Nathan plays that role to David or something else. He's apparently not part of a company. He's apparently not the only, but one of a small handful of prophets serving the royal house of David. But here we see another kind in 2 Kings, and it's also a funny story, although this part that we're going to look at isn't as funny. What's funny is when the prophets try to line up the prophets of Baal against the prophets of Yahweh and see which one can bring fire down from heaven to start some wet logs. And the Israelite prophet suggests that the prophets of Baal have their gods gone to the bathroom or is on the toilet. So there's some bathroom humor in the Hebrew Bible, but we're not going to look at that part of the scene here. Instead, let's focus on the role of prophets here in 2 Kings. So the company of prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today Yahweh will take your master away from you?" His master being Elijah. And he said, "Yes, I know, keep silent." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for Yahweh has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As Yahweh lives, and you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The company of prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today Yahweh will take your master away from you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know. Be silent." Then Elisha said to him, "Stay here, for Yahweh has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As Yahweh lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them as they both were standing by the Jordan. So what we see here is there are two groups of prophets, one headquartered in Bethel and one headquartered in Jericho, and they consist of at least 50, obviously more because it says 50 of the company. The king had some 400 prophets, and Elijah and Elisha have some smaller number, although in other places they're listed as more. The point here isn't how many. The point is they're a community. They're a group that are together, either working for the king, in which case they're basically staff, or here is a community perhaps for mutual protection against the murderous wrath of kings like Ahab and his wife Jezebel, who are the opponents of people like Elijah and Elisha in these stories in 2 Kings. So with those stories in mind, we have to ask, are those stories known to the authors of the David and Saul and Samuel story? Certainly, this is about later history, a couple hundred years later, and one of the questions people have in terms of the composition of the Deuteronomistic history is the story of David succeeding Saul written long before most of the rest of it, which is written roughly when those events happened, or sometime even after that. And that's probably the case. So it may well be that at the time of our passage that we see on the screen here, there was no tradition that was known as companies of prophets other than from this scene. So it may in fact be something new for the audience to see here. And if that's the case, we don't know what their role is or who they work for, and none of that's ever said, other than the fact that it says Samuel is standing in charge of them. So it seems to be a group of prophets connected somehow to Samuel, but we don't know exactly what that means. So let's look now more closely at the scene itself with our translation up here to help us in places and our key words. And each time now that it says fell into prophetic frenzy, I'm going to translate it as it comes up in the prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, which you can see from my note below, 77 times in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, 7 times in Amos, and then a few times elsewhere, including the story that we just looked at from 1 Kings. But when we see that, there's almost always translated as he prophesied, not in a frenzy or a prophetic frenzy like here, which gives a certain viewpoint that I'm certainly for modern ears suggests they're either crazy or they're writhing around on the ground or they're speaking incoherently, or perhaps it brings up, if you're familiar with charismatic traditions in the Pentecostal Christian tradition of people speaking in tongues, but that's not necessarily at all that's happening here. When Jeremiah and Ezekiel are said to prophesy, they're speaking Yahweh's truth to the people. truth that people might not want to hear, but it's Yahweh's truth. And certainly Samuel as a prophet was doing some of that. Certainly in 1 Samuel 8, when he's conveying what the cost of having a king would be. They're conveying it directly from the mouth, so to speak, of Yahweh. That isn't what's happening here. Yahweh, curiously, is not even in this scene. It says a spirit from Elohim came upon the messenger. So Yahweh's actually not in this scene at all. But with that in mind, let's see how it unfolds. And if we translate it as prophesied. So when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing in charge of them, the Spirit of God came upon the messenger of Saul, and they too prophesied. Notice how different it sounds if you hear that they're speaking God's truth, even if we don't hear what it is, rather than falling. Because there's only one word, nabi, here for this whole phrase, fell into a prophetic frenzy, a grossly over-translated element there from the New RSV. So when Saul was told, notice this is the second time that he's got people in Naioth here in Ramah to tell him, because it can't be these people, because they're now prophesying. So the people he sent end up prophesying, and somebody else goes back and he has to keep sending more, as we see here. So as my note below says, this must last a long time. When Saul was told, he sent others, and they too prophesied, and again a third time, and they also prophesied. The narrator not wasting time on a lot of detail for that. And after the third time, although I note that the third time it doesn't say that anybody else went and told him, either the second time or the third time, but that has to be implied, or it's inferred by Saul by the fact they just didn't come back for a long time. But the writer is particularly economical here in conveying this scene for the purpose of getting us and Saul to Ramah, which is what we see here. So he himself went to Ramah, and we ought to expect some suspense here, because we know that the last time Saul and Samuel together was not so happy, when Samuel was upbraiding Saul for violating the covenant that they had made, not Yahweh's covenant, but the covenant and agreement they had made, and Saul is kind of dragging his tail behind him and hoping that Samuel won't embarrass him in front of everybody. So the thought that he might run into Samuel here in his hometown might be something that makes Saul nervous, but that's not what happens. He came to the great well that is in Seku, unfortunately something we know nothing about, although a well is often a symbol of female sexuality, especially in the book of Genesis, which we're noting in our last video, many echoes of here, especially Jacob meeting his future wife Rachel at a well, but we don't know if there's a particular element of that here. So this great well that's in Seku, again, we don't know what that location is. And he asks, where are Samuel and David? Notice he's not asking about his own messengers. And why does he want to know about Samuel? As Falcoman notes, he thus acknowledges who controls the district of Naioth, and that it is impossible to bypass Samuel to reach David. But wouldn't Saul be a little bit afraid to be asking for Samuel here? He was told that David was with Samuel, but I would think if I were Saul, I'd be hesitant. But someone tells him where they are. He'd gone to Ramah. Notice that Naioth is here, some subset of Ramah, because he's already in Ramah, and now he's told they're somewhere else, and he goes there toward Naioth and Ramah, again emphasizing the repetition of this name, which we don't know exactly what it means. And the Spirit of God came upon him, just like it came upon the others in verse 20. Notice we'd previously looked at an evil spirit from Yahweh had come upon him, but now a spirit from Elohim came upon him, and as he was going, he too prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. So somewhere along the way, and it can't be very far, between Ramah and Naioth and Ramah, the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he prophesies until he got there. And when he gets there, an amazing thing happens. He also, one of the 8 times here, stripped off his clothes. We'd not heard that the others had stripped off their clothes, so that's new information here. But the stripping off of clothes brings back a couple of echoes. As my note below shows, in 18:4, the recollection of Jonathan giving his princely garments to David, and also David refusing Saul's royal armor in order to fight Goliath. So when Saul strips off his clothes, for the moment he's no longer a king, which will lead to the question, is he among the prophets? In other words, has he given up his royal robes in order to join the prophets? That seems to be the question that we hear here. But why he is prophesying before Samuel and lay naked all that day and all that night is not clear. The word for naked here, arom, is only in Genesis 2:25. Of course, the man and the woman were naked and unashamed in the garden. In terms of the sequence of the Bible, and only here in the entire Deuteronomistic history. It's a couple of other times that mostly metaphorically naked, and perhaps this is meant meant to be metaphorically naked as well, even though in the immediate scene it's described in terms of him literally taking his clothes off. But to say he's naked is to say he's vulnerable. He's exposed. The Spirit of God has filled him, and he's just there like a baby, naked all day and night, speaking God's word, although we don't hear exactly what the word is. And so it's potentially a turning point. It's potentially a point where Saul could say, I'm wrong trying to kill David. The Spirit of God is upon me. I now understand that Yahweh has given David the reign, and that's a good thing, and I'm going to celebrate that. But of course, that's not what happens. And we'll see, and David knows that's not what's happening, because although we don't see Saul and David interact directly, the first thing we hear in chapter 20, as you can see, is David fled from Naioth and Ramah and turned to Jonathan, another of his supports. And that's where we'll go next time. See you then for another long round between David and Jonathan.